Okay, everybody. So I don't have anyone else to help me yet today, but that's okay because today we got to cover some of the basics, what I'm going to call level 0, to do with pugilistic skill. Now we're going to end up approaching this basically like 3 ways. One is going to be through Western boxing. 2 is going to be through Chinese boxing, and 3, I'm going to introduce some of the basically, you could call it dirty boxing, you could call it skills from drunken boxing, grand ultimate boxing, whatever you want to call it, that will introduce you to some techniques to make you that much better of a striking artist. But before we go all there, whether it's handwork or footwork, we've got to talk about some basic philosophies surrounding fighting and boxing in general. Because you'll see this a lot. You'll see people argue about styles, argue about the size of the person. You'll see them argue about different era boxers. And we've got to address all this through our art of war science. Number 1, I want to introduce you to the 5 factors as far as the physical part of the fight goes. Assuming all height and size are the same, the most important things in a fight are going to be the distance, and then the timing, then the angle, then the speed, then the power. Now, willpower and heart and all of that over here, having a good strong gut, a good strong chin, all of that is still really important. But we're just talking about from the offensive end, the things that you need to control have all to do with creating the configuration, creating the sure. And the difference between Western boxing and Chinese boxing and street fighting and all those dirty tactics is really actually important to discuss. Okay, let's take Western boxing first. In Western boxing, there are basically unorthodox and orthodox styles. And the orthodox styles are that Olympic collegiate style boxing. You look at Evander Holyfield in the 80s. Again, also Mike Tyson in the early 80s. You look at somebody who's really very clean and polished like Roy Jones Jr. These guys are orthodox boxers. They're extremely excellent boxers. Also even Lomachenko, although he's got some unorthodox to him. The difference between them and the unorthodox fighters, the most typified by Muhammad Ali, but also Sugar Ray Leonard is another great example. And even to some degree, Rocky Marciano was pretty unorthodox, hitting a 300-pound heavy bag to just let people beat you up and then just hit as hard as you can. Same thing, George Foreman, letting people hit you so that you can get that one hard hit. That's an unorthodox style. But between these two, relatively speaking, compared to Chinese boxing, you have a really great range of like counter and defensive styles. And it's not to say that there aren't offensive styles. There's some really, like Lomachenko is a very offensive oriented person. Manny Pacquiao is a pretty offensively oriented person. However, look at Floyd Mayweather Jr. and his success, and look at the longevity in Joe Louis. These are people who were mostly counter fighters or even defensive fighters. They loved baiting a person in. Even Ali, towards the end of his career, rope-a-dope, that is an unorthodox style. It's also a very, very defensive style. And so, in general, Western boxing can be said to be very conservative. And this is typified by the jab, okay? So there's 3 types of jabs that you got to work on. First of all, you need to work on your stance. There's a lot of fighters, okay, this is a defensive fighter's position. I prefer to open it up a little bit, but not too much. And you can even, depending on the angle, you can cover in different ways. So like you can practice a cross where you actually cover all this area here and you're crossing from here. Okay? So, first work on your jab or your stance. Okay, but now if you got your stance, all right, your typical jab is going to go straight out like that and it's going to extend. But there's also a flip jab. Okay? Now, the difference between the use of these is really important because on a level 1 understanding, you're using this single jab the same way that most people use pawns in chess. They're moving it forward and establishing a barrier. Well, that's very different than a player who puts his arm out there and holds it, right? He's using some sticking technique to try and engage, and then he's heat sinking, right? As soon as he gets a chance, then he throws that cross in there. All right, now a flip jab is totally different. A flip jab can either be distraction, it can be just mud in the eyes, just kind of putting it out there, and it's usually to change the rhythm. So it'd be flip, flip, jab, or a cross there at the end. All right. Now the third kind of jab is the kind where you actually are coming from underneath, and this would be typified in your Chinese style fighting as either leopard style or monkey style, something like that, where you're actually leaning in and then you're extending, and it's a little unorthodox. Now, back to the difference between the Western and the Chinese style, or in general, Eastern. Eastern styles are based on predatory behaviors of animals. So there's usually only two types over here. There's usually either the offensive fighter or the counter fighter, and both of them are aggressive. Because if you're not aggressive, pretty much you're leaving the chance of the fight to the person who has the most bulk, who has the most energy to conserve, who has the most power to conserve, right? Because the power can be lost as the fight goes on, as your breath gets worn down. So the person who is able to take control of the sure, usually who's the person to first strike, or the person to first move, or the person to first take the center and then hold the center, or the person to first take someone to the ground, is usually going to be the person who has the sure. All right. Now the sure can be lost, whether it's on the ground or whether you're in the center or not. You can lose the sure. And look at George Foreman versus Ali again, classic. Leaning on the ropes, he had no sure, but over time he was eating away at George's power until the sure switched, and then suddenly he was dominating the ring. Everyone thought he was losing the entire time until the very end. Muhammad Ali was the only, even his own trainer, they didn't know what he was doing. He was the only one who knew that he was winning, except for I guess maybe George over time, when George started to feel that drain. But so the sure can be lost at any moment, so it's always really important to conserve it. But if you're using an offensive style, you need to conserve it on the run. So, for example, instead of having a normal route where you're waiting on somebody to come in, you need to have a route that's floating. It needs to be that you can actually like jump to the side and throw your hook or throw your jab all at once. All right, so that's the difference between the offensive, the general tendency of the two basic forms of pugilism that we're going to discuss. I'm not an expert of historical European martial arts, so I don't know much about striking in the 1600s in Europe. But if it's probably the root of Western boxing, I would say that it was pretty conservative, because they had, they used armor a lot. They were really concerned about their own personal safety, as they should be. A lot of the Chinese boxers, especially also the Japanese, like the jiu-jitsu guys, they were pretty nuts. They were willing to go all the way to death. They didn't hardly wear armor. I mean, Musashi was out there dueling with no armor. Masoyama was, when he went to all the dojos and he was beating people up, he had no special armor or anything. He didn't wear brass knuckles. So my assumption is, because in Europe there was an emphasis on technology and on armor, that would lead towards the conservativeness. And my evidence for this is that the very old underhanded, which we would call it upper, we're going to call it upper jab, that they like to lean back a lot to what's called fake the distance. Right, again, controlling the distance is one of the most important things, probably the most important on the physical level, right? Because if somebody even gets a shot and it's close, you can be like what's called the arrow at the end of its power, right? It can just come right at the end and just bounce off of you. So they can punch you, but if you move that distance, if the effective range of the punch, well, a punch's effective range is typically about this, right? But if at the end of that you just move it back, it doesn't matter if they hit you. Right, and in that time you can do things like you can slip and throw in the jab. There's a lot of little dirty tricks. Now, as far as the street fighter is concerned, most street fighters I've seen are always offense oriented. Right, their best defense is their offense. There are a few really defensive fighters, but from what I've seen, they like to be a counter fighter at first, a little defensive. And then they kind of get a feeling of what the guy is doing, and like most Eastern martial artists, they don't like to put up their hands. They don't like to stick out. They want the person to know as little about them as possible, so they even drop their hands. And by doing so, you don't give away too much information, and you get kind of a feeling for the person. So this is, again, a lot like Muhammad Ali, very unorthodox style. And then as soon as you know a little bit, boom, it's just sort of like a monster coming out of the person. I think that it's an important skill to tap into, that animal power, and the ability to, vibratorily explode, to be, here and look kind of like, even woozy, even a little bit weak, kind of soft, and kind of, it's a little bit like drunk, it's a little bit like monkey, kind of just, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, and then you attack really quickly, and you strike, of course, as precise as possible. A couple things here that are really important to develop, even with your jab, even when you're jabbing straight line into something. Number one, you want to develop your stopping power. And the way I like to do that is I'll push the bag off, and it's a 100-pound bag, so it's not the biggest bag in the world, but I'm not planning to hit anybody whose head weighs more than 100 pounds. So when that bag comes swinging back at me, I like to then throw a single jab and see if I can stop it without it stopping me. Does that make sense? So like I give it momentum and then some, so that it loses the momentum it had and then goes the other way. And on that note, defensively, I like to also practice pushing the bag and letting it run into me. I'll do that from the side, I'll do it from the back, so that I always get a chance to feel that power. A lot of people, they like at the classes when we do the exercise where you push the arm off, I don't assume that I have that space. So I actually grab the back of the bag and lean into it, because in Western boxing, although you can hold the break, you can actually legally, until the ref tells you not to, you can keep hitting. And in a street fight, you might as well, because no one's gonna come and go, hey, break. So you've got to be able to throw those shovel hooks from down low, uppercuts. You've got to be able to squeeze up tight and squeeze the whole core and coming straight up. I mean, assuming that their head is right next to you, you've got to be able to put a knockout level power with precision on point in that moment. So mastering the distance from beyond double distance, which is beyond your kicks, to single distance, to half distance, to zero distance is absolutely valuable. And that means also mastering the orthodox and unorthodox at everything. You got to learn how to fake the distance no matter what. You got to fake the distance at double, where you're sticking your leg out. They don't know now you're at single because it looks like you're at double distance. But you got to also fake the distance when you're at zero, which sometimes means like you hit, and then you push away, and then you've got the proper range for a cross. Some other things that I consider, a 101 that you need to know before you're actually looking at individual techniques. Of course, you need a proper jab, you need a proper cross. You can also do what I call the piston jab, which is where it's straight up, and the reason so that your wrist doesn't go off the side. Remember, in a street fight, you're not going to have a wrap on. In a self-defense situation, you're not going to have a wrap on. So you got to watch out against boxer's fracture, which is when you punch here and then this wraps around and hits that cheek and it smashes your hand or breaks your wrist. So, you can use the vertical here, but some other one-on-one stuff, you got to understand what covering means, right? It's not just like this, right? Because all this is open, all this is open, all this is open. You need to know your 4 gates. So if I turn this way, you got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And classically in martial arts and kickboxing, you would use the leg for the 3 and 4. But in regular pugilistic skill, we'll just stick to here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can actually use that elbow or that forearm ridge if you prepare it as a weapon. So they start striking, and then you hit the top of that hand. All right, and if you do it right, look at this. Now it's loaded for your upper jab. So you need to know the basic strikes, like punches and crosses, hooks, and uppercuts. But you also need to know the modifications of those. So we talked about the flip jab, right? And then in the cross, you have where you can slip and cross like that. You've also got the overhand. And then you've got your normal hook, which comes across. And I see this a lot. People are real weak like this. Bring that elbow up. And it needs to come right across. Just like a crescent kick, it should be coming right across the face. Or an arcing cross. So an arcing cross looks like this. It's not a haymaker, because a haymaker is just a wild swing. Okay, if people are haymaking, usually that means they don't know anything about fighting. They are still dangerous, and you have to be really careful around them. But it's mostly animal emotion. You can actually steal that energy and use it against them if you really know how. And of course, you could make yourself look like the victim, even if you were a bit of the aggressor. Like if you were a bit bellicose, and then they got mad, and then they just start flailing. You can actually prove that you're the victim there if you stay calm. So learn to control that arcing cross, which uses that Tai Chi technology of the half moon shape. and it presents a lot of power. Now, in Western boxing, they use what we would call Southern Kung Fu stances, and they would use the high frame of that. So, for example, their bow stance is going to typically be like this, whereas in Southern Kung Fu, it's going to be just slightly lower, and in Northern Kung Fu, it's going to be even lower to the middle frame. And it doesn't matter if you're doing the arcing cross, that's still going to be kind of a middle frame like that. But in Western boxing, might just be a high middle frame. And so they're the same stances. It's just that the better boxer is going to know how to use little things like combining the soft and the hard. They'll be able to use that arching, but they'll be able to use the arching while moving too, and they can have that floating root. Obviously, footwork in any Kung Fu situation, right? If you want to achieve Kung Fu of anything, the footwork is where it really comes from, because the earth is what provides your energy and your power, and it goes through your waist and then through the arm and the shoulder. But it doesn't mean that you don't need a strong frame. First of all, you need strong bones and joints to deliver the power and also to take the power back. But that being said, you really need to have good control over the waist and the hips, where you have that rotation and that you have the oomph. So just like in basketball, you need oomph to back someone down, butt out and shoulders back. Then in the boxing, you don't just need stopping power, you need oomph as well. The difference there being stopping power means the delivery of the energy is potent. And oomph means that when you hit, not only is it potent, but there's like this internal grunt to you that delivers a little bit extra. And that oomph makes the difference between the normal heavyweights and the super hard-hitting heavyweights, whether it's George Foreman or Tommy Morrison or Merciless Mercer. These guys, because look at Evander Holyfield and Roy Jones Jr. are very great technical boxers, some of the greatest of all time, but they weren't known to have the most stopping power. Actually, both of those guys worked up to heavyweight division. They just weren't naturally heavy hitters. When you take someone like Mike Tyson, he wasn't a big guy. He was only 5'9", and he was juicing, but he developed his power through animal power, right? He used raw animal nature. He used that vibrational. He also put a little bit of torque. He loved the shovel hook overhand, and he loved left hooks because left hooks are unexpected amongst many people. But when you talk about oomph, you're really talking about people like Marciano and Foreman and Joe Frazier, who, when they hit, the world seemed to shake. And to create that kind of stopping, of course, the ultimate stopping power I've ever seen is George Foreman's 1994 knockout, where he just walks forward and just sticks a jab out there. And because he's linked up to the ground and he has that linkage, which we will discuss when we get to the Xingyi and dirtying up our boxing, that linkage that he gets, and it connects through the guy, and there's a little bit of twisting and a little bit of rotation. It was actually what is termed an empty punch, and the empty punch delivers more power for less cost. And George knew this because he was more than 40 years old. He'd been boxing a long time in his life, and he knew how to measure the guy had no energy left to withstand that kind of assault. So as you can see, there's a whole lot of things. I know some of that is not 101, but my main point is that, first of all, get your jabs down to where you're doing them the same way every time, and you're always landing very accurately, and then you're working on distance. So in an exercise, if you want to go you have somebody hold up a piece of paper, and you have them say either miss, tap, or hit. Okay, and if you miss, obviously you miss. If they say tap, then you make it just barely knocks into the paper. It's just kind of and if they say hit, then you go through the paper, and it should make a completely different sound. And then you should develop your vibrational, your Jin as well as your Li. You can't just lift weights and be really strong at fighting. It doesn't work that way. There's been plenty of weightlifters who lost in MMA and boxing. You have to have that little bit of vibration. So it can't just be all muscle. It's got to be the whole body has to shake as you hit all the way through. And towards the end, if we can develop you guys, and maybe if you could send me videos of your techniques, and we'll try and give you some tips on how to improve your strike. maybe we will work up to understanding also the philosophy of the thunder striking, okay? Because there is a huge difference in delivery power with thunder striking. And at the very, very end, if y'all do really well, then I'll introduce you to the super hit, the super punch, and maybe even demonstrate a couple of the thunder legs too. So this is a series that I'm going to be excited about. Obviously, I'm limited. If I don't have somebody to demonstrate a technique on the proper delivery location, then I don't have that. One last thing to say before we go. There is no substitution for cardiovascular strength and workout. You've got to be able to last a long time. Or at the very minimum, if you're fat, you've got to be able to control your breath and conserve and take those hits like a butter bean until you can deliver that killer knockout. There's a lot of ways to achieve the accomplishment of the sure, and then to turn that into the G, which is the delivery mechanism. And there's almost an infinite number of ways. It seems like I'm sure we're seeing a lot of the same stuff over and over again in boxing. It's just different bodies and different temperaments, so it looks like brand new to us almost. I see these videos and like, does Lomachenko teleport? Now, he's not doing anything that isn't in Kung Fu already, that hasn't existed forever, that you wouldn't see Bruce Lee doing, right? But the difference is the way he's able to do it and to be present at the time. That's the warrior skill. To achieve warrior skill requires constantly sparring. That's not something I have time for right now to constantly. I can speak about from a time when I did spar constantly all the time and what that feels like when you get into the flow. But the only way you're going to experience it is if you spar all the time. So work towards finding a partner who you can really trust, who's not going to be ego big-headed, not going to try and like beat you down or make this about, like who's the better of the two of you friends, but who really wants to know those skills, and that will take a couple hits with you, and you work your way up. You start 25% speed, and you go 50%, and each one is just like sex. You need to be able to say no. You say, hey, listen, my energy is really low today. I've been working all day. Let's start at 25% speed and build up some of these techniques. I'm going to work on my defense, let you throw some strikes, and I'm going to work on my obliques. Someone who's not going to be like, oh yeah, and then just like nail you in the head, and then your chi is going to sink within you. You're going to get despondent, lose your confidence. That's not going to be any good. And when you're not doing that, if you really want these skills, then you have to spend time observing the videos. You have to go online and get on Funker Tactical and get on all these street fights videos and start absorbing and look at the distance. Try and tell yourself, it's double distance, single distance, half distance, zero distance. It's obvious if there's zero distance, right? And start determining, like, hey, how'd that fight switch? How'd that fight lose? How did he knock him out in the first hit? Was alcohol a helpful factor or a losing factor? Because sometimes it obviously makes the person more invulnerable, and other times it makes their energy just go out like that. So it is, and that's going to affect your breath. If you get into a bar fight and you're boxing and striking, and you're not just grappling, because with grappling, the cool thing about grappling is you can hold off until you start to sober up, because your adrenaline will start to help you sober up, and then, you're holding and clinching until. But if somebody else comes in to hit you, then you're done for. If you're standing, you're going to have to build up your chi really quickly to where your breath comes back, and your body will start sweating and trying to get all that poison out so that you can get control of your energy back. But for a while, you're going to be kind of like a raw meat bag, and you won't have that buffer of energy. You're going to be vulnerable, and it doesn't matter if you're 200 pounds, 300 pounds. You know what they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. If you have no protective energy, if your defense energy is all gone, you're going to go down really hard just as easily, especially because probably somebody who's even smaller, they're going to think, this guy's huge, I need some leverage, and they're going to pick up something like a bottle or a bat, and they're going to hit you, and you're just going to go out because you're not going to have the energy. So always be careful about environmental awareness, situational awareness, nature awareness, social awareness, and your self-awareness too. Like, know how inebriated you are, how is your breath. It's really hard to do. That is its own skill. It falls a little bit in the self-defense and survival skills, but basically, if you're going to study these striking arts, if you're going to study pugilism, not only do you need to study the different forms of pugilism and their advantages and disadvantages on each other and within themselves, but you've got to study the advantages of terrain. You've got to study the advantages of numerical odds, and you know that might mean weight differences. It might mean number of people differences, and the footwork is going to vary between them, right? I mean, Lomachenko is going to do a whole lot better in a fight against multiple people than somebody who's really flat-footed and who stands around like a George Foreman or whatever. Because George can take a lot of hits, but I doubt he could take a Louisville Slugger to the head. But a person like Muhammad Ali and Lomachenko, they could dance around, they can change the distance, they can work on angle, and then with their mouth, you know, especially with Ali, right, with his mouth, he can get in someone's head. A lot of people, they like to say Mike Tyson would eat Ali alive. I beg to differ, because the fight starts at the conference. And that's when a person like Ali would start to get under Mike Tyson's skin. Mike Tyson was very insecure as a person. I don't think he could have handled it. He would have been shaken up before he even got into the ring, and then Ali would have just danced around him, and he would have gotten him. He had a lot longer reach. He had just as much weight, and believe it or not, he had a massive amount of stopping power, especially from 1960 to 1967. So people they make a lot of assumptions about how things would go, and what they're basing it on is all external. It's all shallow. And what I'm trying to tell you is that there's a science and mechanisms behind all this. And the more you study and understand those things, and the more you get some of the vocabulary that I'm going to hand off to you, the better you are. And as far as like the mechanics with the hits and everything, there's no substitute for bag work. There's no substitute for sparring. You just got to do it if you really want those skills. I mean, even with the paper tap or using a mirror, shadow boxing, etc., it's not really going to cut it in the long run. You've got to actually do those things. Later on, in much further into the series, we'll talk about some of the classical Chinese ways to toughen yourself up. Don't worry about all that right now. Like, don't run out and get in a fight. So, as Will Smith says, I love this saying: if you ain't starting nothing, won't be nothing. So don't go getting into fights, especially if you don't have any kind of pugilistic skill right now, or if again self-awareness, you're just not built for it. If you're not a bellicose person, if you're very thin framed, or if you're female, like just watch how you do all. And while you're secretly developing, you can develop that inner tiger until one day you'll be surprising, and then people will be like, "Holy cow! I had no idea that this person was any kind of skill." And of course, the big joy is keeping that totally a secret. If you like this video, share and subscribe. Hit the notification bell, and do only share to cool people. I really don't want the entire world of bullshito activists coming on and telling me what they know about striking. I don't honestly care what they think they know. I don't know everything. They don't know everything. We're here to talk about the science that I've uncovered, and just please don't go putting it on some kind of weird forum and stuff. Then again, if you have like a Facebook group and everybody's studying the science of pugilism, please do share it there, because of course we can all learn and we can grow together. And I would like people to understand the value of the Chinese or again East Asian pugilistic systems, because they're different, but they're just as good. They just have a different framework, a different mode of being, and how they should work. And we will cover the Tai Chi phenomenon, all the people losing. We'll cover all that in other videos. So this has been it for the boxing level 0. I will see you next time.